Fine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the session Beyond Open Textbooks, Sustainable Open Practices in Infrastructure. My name is Mary Gu, and I'm Program Lead with the Open Library.
And my name is Siri Gauthier. I'm the coordinator for the Open Library. So we wanted to start our session with a land acknowledgement. The offices of eCampus Ontario, located in downtown Toronto, are within the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Both speakers live on these same territories as settlers. We acknowledge and we thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have, currently do, and will continue to mark this territory. And we also ask that you consider the caretakers of the lands and waters on which you are situated.
So today we'll be covering a few topics in our session. We want to start by giving a brief overview of eCampus Ontario to put some things into context, and then move into a discussion of OER sustainability, how the Open Library scaled up, and finally on our program supports in support of the scale up.
So we are part of eCampus Ontario, which is a provincially funded nonprofit that leads a consortium of Ontario's publicly funded colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes to develop and test online learning tools to advance the use of education tech and digital learning environments. Our mission is to support academic institutions, educators, and learners.
eCampus Ontario has several key program areas, and we invite you to explore these further at your leisure. We wanted to highlight a couple though. So eCampus Ontario supports Ontario's micro-credential strategies through our micro-credentials portal. We provide educator support through Ontario Extend. We have expanding research and engagement on adaptive learning. We also support the Francophone community in Ontario through our experiential learning platform, CAPO. And today we'll be focusing in on the virtual learning strategy and the Open Library.
So there is a lot to share about the Open Library's experience in scaling up in developing practices and infrastructure. We'll be discussing the intertwining impact of OER sustainability factors.
So whenever you're engaging in OER sustainability work, it takes many systems, processes, and people to make happen. We're going to start by considering the topic of OER sustainability from a wide lens and then focus in on the specifics that impacted the Open Library. And when we talk about sustainability, we need to set a common understanding first. I'm sure just the term sustainability brings many associated issues, concerns, and concepts to your mind. Some of the interrelated issues that come to mind for us are sustainable development goals, environmental impacts, longevity of OER and our systems, finances and costs of the work, human capability and capacity, and naturally, infrastructural capability to evolve alongside the needs and complexity of OER. Today, we will focus on a couple interrelated factors as we share the Open Library's experience with scaling up and the interrelated factors around OER sustainability that came up for us in this experience.
So let's start by talking about those interrelated factors. So this image by Ethan Pullman from the Engaging with OER LibGuide is a great visualization of the life cycle of OER from ideation into use and preservation. So this visual is just a good reminder of the various activities that can happen with any single OER. At all stages, there are interrelated factors that are engaged where major changes in any of one of these actions has a rippling impact. So these things include staffing, technical infrastructure, planning, policy and process, documentation, and finally, community support. So these factors have all been points of reflection and consideration for the Open Library as we scaled up in 2021.
So what did it take for the Open Library to scale up from a collection of around 600 OERs to more than double that collection? The short answer is a lot of work from librarians, developers, internal IT teams, and the generous support of our colleagues in other departments. But let's go into a bit more detail. So as mentioned, eCampus Ontario is a provincially funded nonprofit consortium, and the Open Library is a service that was launched in 2017. It has grown in many ways over the years to support our community in expanding their work in digital learning, and especially in engaging with open education. What you see on the screen is a very brief history of some of the major milestones for the Open Library. And in late 2020, the Virtual Learning Strategy, or VLS, as you may hear us call it, was announced. This instigated a lot of work in scaling up the Open Library in 2021 in order to meet the needs of VLS. The Virtual Learning Strategy, or VLS, is a historic investment by the Ontario Ministry of Colleges and Universities to drive growth and advancement in virtual learning across the province's post-secondary institutions. The first round of funding was distributed in 2021 and resulted in hundreds of projects being supported and more than 500 educational resources created. Naturally, the Open Library had to scale up to accommodate this immense output, and scaling up included thinking about how we engaged in sustainability measures throughout this work. With VLS came a number of new items and features. The Open Library was looking at going from, as mentioned, a 600-ish collection of primarily open textbooks to adding 500 plus new educational resources. Not only that, we were going to be encountering new formats and file types, items created in languages other than English and French, full series of content, and massive file submissions. These features for these educational resources had big implications for the Open Library in our backend and our front end. And we want to talk a little bit about these implications based on those interrelated factors we talked about earlier. But let's ground this in an example. Let's talk about our playable serious game. This is actually a very good example of the type of educational resource that was created by the VLS. So this item is open access. The project teams created several different resource files that were made available. And those include editable HTML files, link to GitHub where the files are hosted, a digital PDF with an instructor guide on how to use this OER, as well as video files. This included MP4 file for the actual video, as well as a link to where this video file is hosted on YouTube. So how does Open Library take in an educational resource like this and make it viewable and accessible to our users? So we need to consider the features and the implications at every level. And I want to talk through these features against those interrelated factors we talked about. So we have it organized here as a chart in order to consider how these factors interrelate with each other. Let's consider the first one. So we know that we have this playable serious game. The first bucket we want to consider is probably the biggest bucket in terms of breadth. Here you need to consider the planning, policy, and processes, both the internal and external processes that can come with a new requirement. You need to start your long-term planning based on these new features and requirements. You also need to consider your policy implications. And let's focus on one type of questions that would come up with something like a playable serious game. First is, who can access this resource? Well, this comes down to what is the license applied to this resource? Then what information about this resource should be made available? As well as when can a user access it? Well, the Open Library is a digital library, so the answer to that is at all times. And where would a user be able to discover this resource? And how would a user access information about this resource? And how would they access the resource files? Of course, none of these questions are going to be answered in a vacuum. The Open Library already exists at the point that we were planning our scale up, and it has existing infrastructure and processes. But the question then is, can it accommodate this new type of educational resource? And what are the impacts that will happen to the Open Library based on making these accommodations? So let's go to the next set of questions, which is the technical infrastructure. Here, let's consider the aspect of having multiple files for a resource. As a reminder, we have editable HTML files, links to GitHub, a digital PDF for the instructor's guide, and video files, which is an MP4 file, is a promotional video, and a link to where this file is hosted on YouTube. Now for our backend, we need to consider, can our repository host file sizes that we might be anticipating for this playable serious game? As mentioned earlier, we've had some educational resources that hit 90 gigabytes. And another question for our backend is, can our repository accept all the different file types, whether it comes to recognizing what the file type is, as well as displaying it in a meaningful way? Now for our front end, we need to consider, does our website show where downloadable files can be accessed clearly, and can it show downloadable files when we have multiple files? How does our website show when a download is happening, especially when we have larger file sizes? It can take a while for a file to download. And how do we show that there is an instructor guide, which can be considered an ancillary or supplementary material? How do we differentiate it from the main OER? Now let's consider the next step, which is staffing. Now we have identified some of the work that has to happen. Who do we have to do this work? We need to think about this in terms of both specific expertise and job, as well as capacity. Do we have in-house expertise and capacity to enhance our front end? Do we have in-house expertise and capacity to do all the cataloging from all of these resources? And of course, if we consider staffing, that leads us into documentation. New features in the fact that this is a grant-supported project meant that there will be some new metadata fields. This required an updated cataloging guide for internal staff, and also cataloging guide that is friendly to having folks who are non-librarians come help us with the cataloging, because we had so many files to get through. We had to update our metadata schema, of course, as well as any training documents, host workshops for additional staff, etc. And then there's also the front end to consider. What kind of documentation is needed for the end user? And is documentation the best way to support their needs? Which brings us to our final concern, which is a very broad bucket as well, which we consider community supports. As a library, the decisions that we make need to be in support of the community that we serve. For our playable serious game, the new file formats and decisions affecting the front end and the back end, as well as the documentation, really interact with the community supports that we decide to develop. Should we host an event on how to use the updated front end? Should we write guides on the different file formats that are now available? Well, we think of these factors as interrelated because each decision in each category can have an impact on other factors, which I hope you got a sense of from our discussion of this playable serious game. Some of which are not immediately obvious. Part of being adaptable is to take in new input as we get new information and change our processes. But moving forwards with some forward planning, good documentation on that planning and decision making is really key to your scale up.
Now we'll move on to those program supports. So one thing I'd like to highlight is that program support is more than workshops. So we've talked about expanding the open library, and with that also came expanding our community and the ways that we support our members. When I started in this role, one of the first steps was looking at the services we offered and how we went about explaining and supporting those services. I could probably sit here and talk ad nauseum about our Pressbooks and H5P instances, but more important than that was how we were supporting those of our community members who were using these parts of our publishing infrastructure to create and adopt OERs. Key to this were two questions. One, what were we hoping our community would gain? And two, how could we enable multiple ways of achieving that? It's one thing to create a workshop schedule in a vacuum, but it's yet another to support community growth. And really a massive part of that is just recognizing that it takes time and effort. There is an investment of time and effort made on the behalf of both organizer and participant, whether that be for things like formal workshops, lunch and learns, or design labs, or even something like an email exchange asking for technical support. So recognizing human effort when considering the ways that you will be working with your community is paramount. And with that also is a recognition that there's trust involved. Preservation acts are inherently trust-based, as is really the entirety of the open movement. When we create an open resource, it is done with a leap into faith that the things that we have worked to create will be treated with care and respect when it is then remixed and remade. And with that understanding that those subsequent remixes will also be treated with respect. This should also extend into the act of preservation, and it does. When someone submits an OER to the open library, they are trusting that we will keep those files and that metadata and ensure it remains accessible and open. And this trust cannot be understated and must be fostered. Part of that is really ensuring that your community is involved in the process. Are they part of an ongoing conversation? Have you asked them any questions? Have you contacted them? Do they have ways to contact you? We've gone through a number of things that the Open Library has done, and while it is obviously very, very important and very interesting, one thing to consider is that even within our community of member institutions, the supports that we give each institution are tailored. The needs of an established Anglophone university with librarians dedicated to OERs are, by their nature, a little bit different to a newly established bilingual Northern college without a physical collection, for example. And one way to ensure this is to make sure you have members in your community who are willing and able to talk to you and share information. This can look like a lot of things. One of those ways is just emails, but one way we have chosen to conceptualize this is with key members. So they're those folks who can and do champion creation, innovation in and around their institutions. They might be willing to help support their colleagues, they might produce stellar OERs, and they might advocate for open access within their campuses. But again, if we go back to that first point, which is recognizing human effort and time, we also have to recognize that this is something that doesn't come without the energy being invested. And with that also comes rewarding key members. It's one thing to have these key members, it's another to make sure they feel valued for the work they're putting in. An example of how we've accomplished this is the Integrating OER project, which gives grants to those who adopt and review OERs. The link is there, you're welcome to peruse at your leisure. And another way we've done that is also just by ensuring that there is a mode of communication. So the community matters and the ways they communicate with you matter too. We've had great luck, obviously, with email, but we've also have something called the Ontario Open Library Network Slack, which is a community wherein users can share information, support, and offer collaborative opportunities. We're sitting at over 700 members, and they come from both inside and outside of Ontario. We've got staff members to help answer questions, but many of the queries submitted actually end up being answered by other users. And so with all of that said, we've got a few takeaways for you, and this includes some guiding questions and some charts.
So we would invite everybody to take a look at this diagram by the Digital Curation Center. We find it really useful in our reflection on institutional readiness. So if you're planning a scale up or considering what you'll be doing in the future, consider looking at this chart to consider your human skills, infrastructure capabilities, and processes. What is currently well documented and understood? What is not? What is in planning now and what is missing? And this is not just for what you're doing right now, it's also for future planning. You need to integrate future planning into your scale up. Some things that might come up for you is environmental concerns, as with many of you might consider. As we scaled up the Open Libraries infrastructure, this brought up environmental concerns about, server space and how much server space we'll be using and what it means for us. Another concern for us in our future planning is access and discovery. We would like to federate our collection, both as a data harvester as well as a data provider, so that make the OERs in our collection more widely accessible and discoverable. Things that we're working on improving is also our digital preservation methods, especially as Siri talked about. There is a trust given to us when we take on the preservation activities for a large collection. And of course, throughout that work, that means updating policies, ensuring that our documentation is up to date for the long-term future of the Open Library. So one of the things we wanted to share is this chart. We talked about it in a more visual fashion earlier, but this is one way to organize some of that information based on those interrelated factors. It is a bit crunched here because there's a lot of information you need to dig through, but we hope that this is one example that gives you something to filter all the information relative to the requirements for your scale up or the feature that is changing against all of the interrelated factors that impact each other for yourself as well as for your users. As well as you can see that we put an example of a specific situation that the Open Library experienced when we were accommodating hundreds of new resources and all the questions and implications it had for us.
And then finally, just a few guiding questions when you're identifying the needs of your community. So how are you engaging with them? Who is your community and what do they need really? And what supports currently exist? What is in planning? Finally, how can they reach you? And are your support systems and communication methods accessible? So with that, we want to say thank you. As always, if you want to learn more, you can visit openlibrary.ecampusontario.ca, or if you have any queries, I know there's a Q&A period after this recording, but if we don't have time or there's something that's maybe a little bit longer, feel free to contact us at open@ecampusontario.ca. And then here are our references.
Thank you so much.